All right, everyone. Welcome. Good morning. And Mira, thanks for letting me know, and hope you get better sleep here in the near future. Um, Question for the day for you on the whiteboard. If you were to have your own late night talk show, who would you invite as your first guest? Kendra Megan Thee Stallion? Good, good. What about the rest of you? Who would you invite? Who's someone you would maybe be interested in talking to? And Mira, I had to quick do like a Google check. I was like, wait, is that the guy from System of a Down? And yeah, it would be. Good. And just got a question about kind of what's the best strategy for answering things on the study guide. And my answer would be your responses should really be based on what's in the K-12 lessons and what we talk about in class. Because there end up being a lot of questions on the study guide that if you just like Google them, they're going to pull up information from things other than government. They might pull terms from like business or economics, for example. So, yeah, you can ultimately find the right answers online, but it's also just very easy to get information from like a business perspective versus a government perspective. Oh, interesting, Mackenzie. What kind of music do they play? Aiden with Grant Gustin. Owen with Neil deGrasse Tyson. Nice, nerd out with them. Good, good. Let's see what else we got here. When was some race car drivers? That's Roger Petty. Nice, cool, excellent. So I need to give you guys a heads up. I got mixed up with slides for today. I wanted to jump ahead into digging into the Constitution. I was like, oh wait, we still need to first talk about creating the Constitution. So technically these slides are from my US history class. That's why it says US history at the top there instead of government. 90% of it's what we would have done with government anyway. But just to clear up, why that says US history on there. That's why. So as we go on to this next slide, then obviously ignore this. This was a US history assignment. We already talked about the Articles of Confederation. But everything else here is vocabulary you're going to want to jot down. So we left off last week looking at the Articles of Confederation and ultimately why that government had some weaknesses, why it didn't really work out for the United States. And so today, then, we're going to look at that transition over to the Constitution, ultimately the governing document that we use today. But also just a couple of reminders on the right. Number one, again, just want to emphasize the importance of checking the course announcements or the course plan every day to see what you need to work on, what lesson is assigned. Make sure you fully work through the lesson. Oftentimes there's a quiz at the end of lessons. And then also just checking your grade book. I would say at least once a week. That's really what lets you see what's going on with your grade. If, for example, your grade suddenly drops, it's probably because you missed an assignment. Go into your grade book, see where you have a 0 listed. That would kind of let you know what assignment you're missing. All right. Give people one last minute to kind of just jot down the vocab list, just because it is kind of a longer vocab list. But as we were talking about last week, the Articles of Confederation created a Confederate form of government, a government that gave most of the power to the individual states, which is what early Americans thought they wanted at the time. They didn't want a strong national government, telling them what to do and getting into their business all the time. But ultimately, that created a federal or national government that had no executive or judicial branches, meaning it didn't have a presidency or a Supreme Court. It had no power to tax. It had no power to regulate trade. It was very difficult to pass any laws because you needed 9 of the 13 states to agree to it. And so then we have a turning point in 1786 with what's called Shays' Rebellion, kind of one of these important pieces of U.S. history that most Americans know nothing about. But the background of Shays' Rebellion was you had a group of farmers in Massachusetts who were in debt. They owed money and couldn't pay that money back. And so because they couldn't pay their debts back, they were at risk of debt collectors coming in and taking over their farms as payment for those debts. And obviously, as a farmer, that's a big deal. You don't want to lose your farm because that's how you make a living. And so out of desperation, these farmers decided to basically form their own army, taking up weapons to fight off the debt collectors and basically rebel against the state of Massachusetts. Now, normally something like that really wouldn't be that big of a deal. Something like that would happen today. We would expect, the government to respond and, bring in the police, potentially bring in the National Guard if it's, a big enough concern, but, and, hopefully come to a peaceful resolution. But, one way or another, the federal government's going to kind of come in and try to bring such a situation to a close. But why might Shays' Rebellion be kind of more of a threat or more of a problem during the Articles of Confederation? If we go back a slide looking at the weaknesses of the Articles of Confederation, why might the government back then maybe have trouble with Shays' Rebellion? Yeah, exactly, Owen. Because the national government was so weak, it really did not have any resources, any power to respond to Shays' Rebellion. Excellent, Simon, because back under the Articles, we really didn't even have a military because the government could not collect taxes. So the government could not pay for its own military. It depended on volunteerism from the states. And if states decided they didn't want to volunteer anything, we were kind of out of luck. So yeah, you have the situation where Massachusetts is in real trouble and looking to the federal government of like, hey, we could really use some help here. And the federal government basically got to shrug its shoulders and be like, I don't know what to tell you, Massachusetts. We got nothing. We have no money. We have no army to send to you to help you out. You're on your own. You're going to have to figure this out on your own. Now, luckily, Massachusetts is able to put a military together, a militia, as it's known, and disperse Shays' Rebellion and bring things to a close. But what kind of signal does this maybe send to the people of the United States? If you were living back then, what is this maybe causing you to think about the government? If it couldn't even handle Shays' Rebellion. Yeah, we're maybe a little undeveloped here. This whole Articles of Confederation thing's maybe not working out. I love that, Mackenzie. Thinking back to our 5 purposes of government. Government's maybe slacking on that job of maintaining order here. It's too weak. It's not able to, protect the country because, if a group of farmers were this big of a threat, what's going to happen to the country if, like, the British decide to show back up and be like, never mind, we want to take you guys over again? Like, we're really not in a position where we could defend ourselves. And so, kind of. Especially then when you also consider that the states are having all these disagreements with one another because the national government doesn't really have any power to keep the states together. It was starting to get real messy by 86, 87. So the Congress that existed under the Articles of Confederation voted to approve a group of representatives from the states coming together to offer up recommendations on how to revise the Articles of Confederation. Which, just so we're all on the same page, what does it mean if you're revising something? Like if you revise a project or you revise an essay that you wrote, what are you doing if you revise it? Yeah, you're kind of updating it, making some changes, remastering it. Are you throwing it in the trash and starting from scratch if you're revising it? No. If you're revising something, the basic idea is, okay, I got a good foundation here. I just got to make some changes to make it better. However, we're going to end up calling this meeting the Constitutional Convention because it's going to result in the creation of an entirely new document, the Constitution. All right, so what happened here? How did we go from, hey, let's make some recommendations to update the Articles of Confederation to here's an entirely new system of government for the United States? I like that one. It's another good way of defining revising. Well, this all kind of begins because some of the people at this Constitutional Convention believed that the Articles of Confederation were such a weak document for setting up a government that there was no fixing it. There was no saving it, that we would just be better off throwing it in the trash and starting from scratch. That included people like Alexander Hamilton, Benjamin Franklin, and especially James Madison, who's oftentimes identified as being the father of the Constitution, who really pushed for just a new system of government. Now, that was kind of a risky push, because on one hand, you could kind of look at that and label it as treason, because basically what they're arguing is for an overthrow of the government of the United States and replace it with a new government. I mean, you think about if you heard on the news of like a small group of people are meeting to create a new government for the United States and overthrow the Constitution, you'd be like, what are those people up to? So you're kind of playing with fire here a little bit. So one of the smart decisions that Madison made early on was to recruit George Washington to serve as the committee president of the Constitutional Convention. Because if you had to take a wild guess, how might the American people back then have viewed George Washington? What was maybe kind of like his reputation? Keeping in mind this would be after the American Revolutionary War. Yeah, he was celebrated as a hero. He was the general that led American forces to victory against the British and ultimately granted us our independence. So while he obviously did not do it alone, the reality is a lot of Americans did kind of credit Washington with being the person that won America's independence. He was easily the most popular, most well-liked person in the country at the time. And so by Madison recruiting Washington to serve as the committee president, that basically borrowed Washington's reputation to kind of help protect this whole mission. Because you would have had people who maybe at first were like, wait, what are these guys doing? They're creating a new system of government? That sounds really shady. Oh, Washington's in charge of it? Oh, well, I trust Washington. You know, if Washington's in charge of things, it must be a good idea. Now, looking at this painting of the Constitutional Convention, even if you know nothing about any of these people, just by looking at the painting itself, anything you notice that these people have in common with one another, just by looking at them, any shared traits or characteristics? Oh, and here, Mary, let me see if I do that, if that helps direct you back to it. So one, yes. As Simon notes, they were all white. Excuse me. Also, generally older. You did have some young people. Hamilton and Madison, for example, were fairly young at this point in time. And then, yeah, William noticing, that many of them have the powdered wigs, that kind of hairstyle. Mackenzie noticing a similarity with their clothing. What does that maybe tell us about their background? What's maybe got to be your reality if you're wearing the powdered wig and the waistcoats and things like that? And William Hamilton would have been older than 22 by this point, because he was born in 57, and this is happening in 87, so about 30, I would think at this point. And then, yes, they were largely rich, financially well off. Many of them owned large amounts of land and different businesses. Many of them were college educated, which was really rare back then because college was super expensive and there was no support system really to pay for it. Upper class, or maybe you could characterize it as being entitled. Anything? Yeah, Simon mentioned, they're all men. That'd be another thing that they all had in common with one another. So with that being the case, what groups of Americans are missing from this meeting to put together America's government? Definitely, we don't have any women here at the Constitutional Convention. We don't really have a whole lot of representation from the lower and middle class. You had a couple, but yes, generally speaking, you really just have the upper class here. What else? Don't have any representation from racial minorities. You don't have any African Americans here. You don't have any Native Americans here. And so, for example, thinking about there not being any women at the Constitutional Convention, how might that impact things as we're putting together this government for the United States if there are no women here at this meeting? What might be the impact of that? Yeah, there's really not going to be much of a discussion on rights for women. And so, for example, when the Constitution is originally written, it's not going to say anything about women having the right to vote, or women having equal rights to men. Ultimately, yeah, there's an element of sexism here because there were no women in the room, to kind of help generate those conversations. Wasn't really something that was brought up as the discussions were had, putting together this new document, this Constitution. Or for example, the lack of African Americans being there, it's going to impact, any discussions on slavery. slavery was discussed during the Constitutional Convention, but obviously if African Americans had been there, they would have provided a different perspective that was not included here. And so it is just kind of an example of, who's involved in the decision-making process can really have an impact on things. The people who were here were discussing and making decisions based on what they thought would be best for the country, but they were all largely coming from similar perspectives. And so that does mean that there's going to be room for improvement. One of the things we'll talk about later on this semester is how future generations of Americans have had to push to make adjustments to the Constitution to address some of these missing pieces early on. Excellent, Eric. Glad to hear that worked for you. Now, that's not to say that the Constitution is a bad document. There's a lot of good things to it. We've ultimately stuck with it for over 200 years at this point. It's worked pretty well for us. But it's also important to acknowledge it's not magically a perfect document on day one. Throughout our country's history, we've had to continuously make changes to it, to update it, to have it better line up with our evolving values as Americans. And there's a good chance we may have to continue to change the Constitution down the road. Okay. But one of the major challenges for the members of the Constitutional Convention was to try to figure out a better balance of power within the country. Obviously, this idea of having a confederate system where we give all the power to the states and nothing for the federal government, that wasn't working out. So we knew we needed to make the national or federal government stronger, but how strong? Because of course, if we give all of the power to the national government, that would also create an imbalance of power. So what's the right balancing point there? Another challenge is going to be, how do we balance power between the states? Under the Articles of Confederation, it became obvious that some states were just kind of more powerful than others. They had more people, they had a bigger population, they had a bigger economy, and could potentially use that to kind of muscle over smaller states. Because on one hand, under the Articles of Confederation in Congress, each state got one vote. And the original idea was, well, that would make things fair for the low population states. But as discussions were being had at the convention on how many seats each state should get in Congress, representatives from the state of Virginia proposed the Virginia Plan, arguing that the number of seats each state gets in Congress should be based on population. Because just as an extreme example, Virginia might say, let's say one state has like 100 people and another state has 1 million people. You're telling me those 100 people in that one state should get the same number of votes as the 1 million people in that other state? That's not fair. That's giving, way more of a voice to those 100 people and really kind of drowning out the voices of those millions of, people. And so Virginia's plan was that representation should be based on population. The more people living in your state, the more seats you get in Congress. So if we were to think about it today, for example, what might be some of the states that would get more seats in Congress under the Virginia Plan? And sorry, thinking about the United States today, like modern day population numbers. So yeah, like California would be at the top of the list. California has the biggest population out of all the states. It would get the most seats. Texas then is number 2. I think New York is number 4 because I think Florida is number 3. Yeah, exactly. Whereas a state like Alaska or Wyoming wouldn't get very many seats because they don't have, large populations. So that's Virginia's plan. That's how Virginia wants to do things. But then on the other hand, you have New Jersey, which back then was a small population state. Why might a small population state like New Jersey have a problem with the Virginia plan? Oh, and William, I think you're thinking of Wyoming. I believe Wyoming has the smallest population. Wisconsin's pretty like middle of the road. If you were a small population state like New Jersey, why might you have a problem with the Virginia plan? Yeah, because it's going to result in you having less representation. Yeah, a fear of, basically getting outvoted by the large population states. Gives larger states more power. Exactly. So New Jersey is going to come up with its own plan saying representation should be equal. Each state should have, the same number of representatives as every other state. So from New Jersey's point of view, that's a more fair system. And so this became a real heated debate between the large population states and the small population states until a compromise was come up with. What's known as the Connecticut Compromise, because the idea came from a representative of Connecticut, or also known as the Great Compromise, because it's the compromise that allows the Constitutional Convention to continue. Had it not been come up with, the whole thing might have fallen apart. So at this point in time, Vermont is not yet a state. Vermont's not one of the original 13. Surprisingly enough, considering, it's right there in the middle of all the other ones. So it would not have been involved in these conversations. So the basic idea of the Great Compromise is taking pieces from both the Virginia and the New Jersey plan. If the Virginia plan is chocolate and the New Jersey plan is peanut butter, the Great Compromise is a Reese's cup. We take some chocolate and some peanut butter, mix it together, create something delicious. So the idea of the Great Compromise is, okay, we're going to have Congress made up of two pieces or two houses. And that way we can kind of do a bit of both to make each side happy. Ooh, and William, if you want to ask me at the end of class, I can double check that. Off the top of my head, I don't recall which state, originally was viewed as like the landholder of what became Vermont. So one of the houses, what will become the House of Representatives, that will be based on population. And so that's how it works today. So nowadays, the House of Representatives is made up of 435 seats. And the bigger your population, the more seats you get in the House of Representatives. So as we mentioned, California, Texas, Florida, they get more seats in the House of Representatives. But then we're going to have a second house, what's known as the Senate. And in the Senate, representation is equal. So in the Senate, every state gets 2 senators. So California gets 2 senators, Wyoming gets 2 senators. Doesn't matter how many people are living in your state, you get 2. So that's how we're going to solve representation in Congress, is we'll have a bicameral legislature, 2 houses. But that then raised a new question. Oh, and awesome there. Mrs. Goldsmith stopping by and visiting. Because if we're going to do representation based on population, well, that means we need to know each state's population. That's going to have to be counted and calculated somehow. And that raised a new question of, Well, how do enslaved people factor into this? Because on one hand, at the time, enslaved people were legally defined as being property. But at the same time, they are obviously human beings. And so this created a major debate. Do they count as part of a state's population number or not? Southern states, which were predominantly the states that practiced slavery and where enslaved people made up a large chunk of their overall population, wanted to say yes. Because that would give them more representation in Congress. But northern states, which by this point had either outlawed slavery or slavery wasn't very popular and on its way out, such as in New York or New Jersey, are saying no, that's not fair, that's not right. You don't get to, label these people as property, and not provide them with, rights as U.S. citizens, and then go around and say, but they should count as part of our, population total for getting more seats in Congress. So again, we had a major divide here, this time between the North and the South. And so again, another compromise had to be made. What's known as the 3/5 compromise, which essentially says, okay, as we're going around to each state every 10 years to do the census, get my drawing tools back here. Every white American will go through and count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. But then when we go into a state's enslaved population, we will count the first 3, and then we'll skip 2. And then, if the diagram continued, you would continue with 9, 10, 11, and then again, you would skip the next 2. And so this is what's known as the 3/5 compromise, that for determining a state's population for representation in Congress, 3 out of every 5 enslaved people would count. And again, that was enough of a compromise to keep the North and South happy and keep the conversation going with putting the Constitution together. But from our modern day perspective, what might potentially be kind of a problematic message of the 3/5 compromise? What does it kind of seem to be saying or representing here? And yes, William, yes, you were right there with some of the historical background. But what kind of message does this 3/5 compromise seem to suggest about people in the United States? So definitely, on one hand, you have some Americans, who were anti-slavery, arguing that enslaved people are people, which of course they are, and shouldn't be legally owned as property and forced to do work. And so if we're counting 3 out of every 5, what does that seem to kind of say, or what does that seem to suggest? Or what kind of message does that send? Right, yeah, it kind of raises the question, well, what about the other two? Do they not count? And so essentially it is the Constitution accepting a message of inequality, that some people in America won't count as much as others, which kind of conflicts with that idea of, a government of the people, and that, all people will be equal in the United States. And so again, here it's just an example that the Constitution was not magically perfect on day one. Ultimately, this compromise was made because it was viewed as being necessary to keep the North and the South together early on. And an argument could be made that if Northern states had resisted, Southern states might have walked away and tried to form their own country early on and broken up the United States. But it does mean that there are going to be some ongoing issues for future generations of Americans to have to fix. The Constitution will accept the practice of slavery in the United States, and will accept this kind of message of inequality. And so again, something we'll kind of explore down the road is how future generations of Americans have fought to transform our government and to try to better live up to that idea that all people are equal and that all Americans get the same rights, regardless of race, gender, or anything like that. So ultimately, then, what is built into the Constitution is this concept known as a separation of powers. We're going to kind of, starting on Friday, take a deep dive into the Constitution and see kind of how it sets things up, but kind of painting the big picture here today. And yeah, William, to your comment, yeah, America was not magically a country of equality on day one. We've kind of set that as a goal to shoot for as a country. But just like any major goal, it's not going to magically happen on its own. That's kind of something that each generation of Americans kind of has to work on, pushing ourselves and pushing our government to kind of better live up to those values. It's one of the reasons why participating in our government is so important, like voting, so we can kind of push government in that direction to kind of better live up to those values. So one of those values that does make its way into the Constitution is this idea of a separation of power, taking the power of government and dividing it up into three pieces or three branches: a legislative branch, an executive branch, and a judicial branch. Because why would we not just want to give all of the power to one piece of government? Why would that maybe be a bad idea? Arguably, yeah, could be so broken. How come? How about giving all the power to, say, the president make things broken? Excellent, Simon, because then there's going to be no system of checks and balances, and we'll talk about what that means on the very next slide. If you're like, what does that mean? And so if there are no checks and balances, if we just gave all the power to the president, how might that go wrong? What theoretically could a president decide to do if he or she had all the power? Yeah, might abuse that power for their own use. Could theoretically just kind of control everyone. Because no one else has any power to push back against that. Or yeah, definitely Owen. So to try to protect against something like that happening, the Constitution creates three branches of government, a legislative branch, an executive branch, and a judicial branch, and tries to evenly divide the power up among the three branches of government. But in addition to that, then, as Simon mentions, we also, under the Constitution, create a system of checks and balances, where each branch of government overlaps some power with the other branches of government and can push back against one another. So, for example, both the judicial branch and the legislative branch have some power over the executive branch, over the president. The judicial branch, the Supreme Court, for example, can strike down presidential acts that are found to be unconstitutional. And the legislative branch, Congress, can potentially impeach and remove a president from office. Which, why would we maybe do that? Why would we want to give the legislative and judicial branches some power over the president? Definitely Owen, because then it provides some safety rails. If you ever do have a president that starts violating the Constitution, the other two branches of government can hopefully step in and push back against that to try to keep things in balance. And then same thing, if Congress tries to pass a law that's just clearly an abuse of power, the president has the ability to veto that law, basically block it from getting passed. And again, the Supreme Court has the power to strike down laws that are unconstitutional. So, each branch of government has some power and control over the other two. So it's basically like a three-way tug of war, where each branch of government is constantly pushing and pulling against the other two, which ultimately kind of serves to keep everything in balance with one another. So again, hopefully power is not being abused. Now let's quickly drip. We're going to talk about this concept of federalism in more detail in a later Class Connect. But basically, as we talked about in Unit 1, federalism is that idea of trying to balance power between the national government and the state governments. So we knew we needed to give the national government some more power compared to the Articles of Confederation, but we didn't want to take all the power away from the states, in part because the states wouldn't have gone along with it at that point. So we embrace a federal system where we try to balance the power between the national government and the state governments. And yeah, William, that was kind of the thought process of, if the American people, ever end up making a mistake and voting for someone, who basically ends up being an imposter, the other two branches of government could keep things from spiraling out of control. So once the Constitution is written, it doesn't just like magically take over. If I were to just write a new document today and be like, this is now the government of the United States, like that's not how things work. So there was then a big debate in the country. Should we switch over to the Constitution or not? Those that were known as Federalists supported the Constitution because it created a federal system of government. Whereas those that were anti-federalist were those who were against the Constitution or were against switching over to a federal system. They largely wanted to stick with the Articles of Confederation, or believed that, the states should largely be in control of things. And so you can kind of see geographically the breakdown where you saw more support for one point of view or the other. Generally speaking, the Constitution had more support along the coastline, and where you typically had more cities, whereas the more rural farming areas of the country tended to more likely be anti-federalist. And so in order to help persuade more people to support switching over to the Constitution, Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, and John Jay combined anonymously wrote a series of essays that become known as the Federalist Papers. Basically, constitutional propaganda trying to explain why the Constitution would be a better form of government for the country. And so ultimately, the Federalist Papers both served to help convince people to support the Constitution, but are also helpful because they provide us with some more understanding of how, people like Hamilton and Madison believed the Constitution should operate. Because as we'll see on Friday, the Constitution ultimately isn't a very long document. It fits on a single page of parchment. You can read it in like a half an hour. So there's some room for interpretation there. Because ultimately, in order for the Constitution to take over, at least 9 out of the 13 states had to vote in favor of it, because that was the standard under the Articles of Confederation, is that you needed at least 9 states to agree to something before it could become law. And according to the Constitution itself, any 9 states would work. But in reality, the country really needed Virginia and New York to get on board with the Constitution. Because those were the 2 biggest, most powerful states. And so if you had a situation where even if all the other states signed on for the Constitution, but Virginia and New York did not, that probably meant this whole thing was going to fall apart, that the country might fall apart. And William, I think you were talking about, I'm not sure which slide you were referring to, but what you see here is the dates of when each state passed or ratified the Constitution. So Delaware was the first, New Hampshire was the 9th. Luckily, Virginia and New York come in soon after. No, so this is just kind of a political cartoon, kind of representing the idea of we need, all of the states to kind of serve as pillars to support and hold up the Constitution. And then you can see that eventually all 13 states got on board. Rhode Island, being the stubborn one, held off until 1790. And gotcha, Simon. Yes. If this is what you're talking to, the numbers up here, that's how many essays each of them wrote. So Hamilton wrote 51, Madison 29, Jay wrote 5. All right. So when we come back on Friday, then we'll start digging into the Constitution and kind of look at the details of how it sets up the government of the United States. If you have any questions about anything, stick around and let me know. Otherwise, you are good to go and have a great day. Thanks, Mary. You too. And then, yes, Mira, to your comment, yes, John Jay was kind of ill during this time period, limited his productivity. And William, it's kind of more of just like the culture of Rhode Island back then. Rhode Island was a very independent-minded state. It was made up of a bunch of people who kind of wanted to do things their own way and didn't want anyone else telling them how to do things. So they really held out on switching over to the Constitution because they didn't want to give up that state independence. But they're also a tiny state. And so when the other 12 states all switch over to the Constitution, it eventually kind of forced Rhode Island to get on board with things as well, or else it was kind of just going to get left behind. Yeah, no, great question. Thanks for asking. And then last call if anyone else has any questions. And yeah, see you, William. Otherwise, I will assume we're good to close things up for today. All right, looks like we are good to